Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. I want you to try something a little, well, unconventional. Imagine opening your eyes for the very first time. But actually, scratch that. Imagine waking up not as a human being with endless potential, but as a strict financial asset. You are literally just a walking, breathing line item on a balance sheet.
Picture this. You're exactly 11 seconds old. The world smells of rose water and blood. But before your mother even has a chance to hold you, there's this very distinct sound cutting through the room. It's the scratch of a quill on parchment. Your father isn't looking down marveling at your tiny fingers. He is already running the numbers. He's calculating your dowry and your startup costs, basically treating your arrival exactly like a ledger that simply doesn't balance.
And what's fascinating about this concept is how it totally strips away the storybook romances of history we're so used to hearing about and reveals this brutal corporate reality instead. Today, we love to think of our lives as these grand narratives, but for most of history, you were an accounting entry. Whether you were a Victorian noblewoman, a Spartan mother, or an Aztec weaver, your existence was part of a rigid system, the human ledger, a rigorous system of credits and debits valuing you solely as an asset, a liability, or a tool.
So for this explainer, we're going to audit your historical life across 4 distinct stages: the initial investment, the price of maintenance, mergers and acquisitions, and finally, depreciation and final balances. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the initial investment, or birth as an audition. Look at the crazy contrast in these initial audits. On the one hand, the Spartan audit. If you're born a Spartan, the first person to hold you isn't even your mom. It's a tribal elder with hands like tree roots who physically inspects you just to decide if you are worth keeping. On the other hand, the Victorian approach. Simply being born a girl makes you an expensive bargaining chip. Your family views you as a product requiring assembly, and they immediately start investing in premium features like piano lessons and watercolor painting. The stakes for this initial investment were absolutely life or death. If you're a Spartan and you fail that first physical inspection, your ledger is permanently closed before it even begins. And for that Victorian girl, those French embroidery and watercolor skills weren't about personal growth or happiness. No way. They were premium features designed solely to prove you had what it took to be a highly marketable asset.
Which brings us to Section 2, the price of maintenance, and protecting that investment.
Because wow, the operational costs to keep your yield high were brutal. Your physical body was literally molded to fit the demands of your society. The Victorian corset, that wasn't just fashion. It was basically a steel cage actively redistributing your internal organs to meet a social aesthetic. Or think about the Spartan girl, sprinting until her lungs burned like a furnace, driven by the terrifying logic that weak mothers make dead soldiers. And as an Aztec concubine, your value was so intrinsically tied to your output that you were essentially viewed as furniture that makes cloth, weaving cotton so fine it was worth more than gold.
For the Aztec concubine, the ledger was 100% performance-based. If you fall short of your weaving quota, you simply don't eat. You are strictly viewed as the machinery of the empire. And just like a broken piece of equipment on a factory floor, if you do not produce, you're immediately cut off from the resources you need to survive.
Moving right along to Section 3. This is where we get into mergers and acquisitions and the total loss of identity.
Let's dive into Victorian England for a second. The ultimate merger was this legal loophole or doctrine called coverture. Under this rule, a woman's entire identity, her inheritance, her legal rights, literally the whole shebang, is completely absorbed into her husband's balance sheet the moment they marry. Even the pearl earrings your mother gave you suddenly belong to someone else entirely. The absolute finality of this transaction is just staggering to think about. Literally, the second the vicar finishes speaking, you legally cease to exist. You instantly transition into being the most expensive decoration in the room. You can't sign a contract, you can't own property, you can't even write a will. Your individual ledger is wiped completely clean.
Now compare that Victorian husband to the Spartan state. It's super interesting because while a Victorian husband absorbs your assets, in Sparta, the state itself acts like a ruthless debt collector. When your son turns 7, the state violently calls in the loan. They shatter your ledger, taking him to the barracks to be unmade and rebuilt for the machine of war. Your job wasn't to be a nurturing mother. Your job was simply to be the factory that produced the soldier.
And that leads us to our final section, Section 4. Depreciation and final balances, where the asset gets written off. Because look, every asset eventually wears out, right? Whether your life was defined by extreme success or immense power, the wear and tear was absolute. If you were a medieval doctor, you drank the poisoned honey of medical success and paid for it with a body that felt like a walking tomb, your joints creaking from decades of crouching over the dying. If you were the Empress of China, you drank the poison cup of imperial power, leaving you a dragon lady with shaking hands, forced to hide behind silk curtains. Your ledger was heavily overdrawn by the time you reached middle age.
You survive, sure, but you survive as a well-preserved ruin. You might be a spark in a dying dynasty or a blade forged in silken blood, but your physical frame bears the undeniable invoice of your era's demands. I mean, your ribs sit at angles God absolutely never intended because of that steel corset, and your very lungs carry the deadly fingerprint of arsenic from the fashionable wallpaper in your own home. The physical cost of maintaining your ledger is written directly onto your body.
And all of this brings us to one remarkably specific, darkly ironic number: 42.
Why 42? Well, for the average Victorian woman, the bitter irony is that freedom only shatters the lock when the owner of the ledger dies. It is only at age 42, and only as a widow, that your legal identity, the one totally erased at age 19, is finally restored to you. And it wasn't because society suddenly valued you as a person, it was simply because the asset owner passed away and the ledger temporarily needed a new manager.
History wasn't always some grand tapestry about who you were. Often it was just a ruthless earnings report about what you cost and who owned you. You survived the fall of empires only to be erased by a single legal decree. So having looked at this human ledger, we really have to look at the balance sheets we exist on today. In our modern world, are we finally more than just entries in a ledger, or have the chains just changed from golden land to something else entirely?
It's a heavy, provocative question to leave you with, for sure. One that definitely shifts how we view our own daily audits. But hey, if you want to dive deeper and see what happens when that ledger finally breaks, and a society decides to build people for sheer physical strength instead of polite compliance, be sure to click and watch our next explainer, Your Life as a Spartan Mother. Thank you so much for joining me to decode this incredible piece of history, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.